All right, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with today's virtual field trip. Just a quick intro to all of you out there. If this is your first experience with the Learn Around the World virtual field trip, this is an interactive experience. That means you can send in your questions. Early and often, I recommend, but send in your questions, and this can be anyone that is watching today. If you're on camera or off of camera, it's interactive for everyone. You can send in your questions to the Q&A app. It should be at the bottom of your Zoom windows. For some of you, it may be in your top corner, one of your top corners, or you can use Twitter if you are on Twitter, teachers. Just make sure you use the hashtag GEOshow if you do use the Twitter option. I do not follow my handle during these shows, so only the hashtag GEOshow is the only way I will see your questions. We also use Kahoots right here on the show. That's the big screen that you saw splashed up on the board a minute ago. So to play along, go to kahoot.it, enter in today's game pin, which is 610-2477. You can play as individual students if you're one-to-one, or you can play as a classroom on your teacher's device as a class. Pay attention, explorers. If you win today's Geo quiz at the end of the program, you'll win a postcard from me, GOB, from the Learn Around the World studio. Also, if you stump me on any questions, great job. I don't know everything there is to know about the Brooklyn Bridge. So if I need to do further research, I will do that and then post my answer to your question over at flipgrid.com/GeoShow. So make sure you check in the rest of the week, especially if you stump me on a question. I'll jot it down and make sure I research that answer. But it is that time of the day, guys. So I want to know from you, explorers, are you ready?
Yeah.
All right, GeoShow is now live. Let's do it, guys. Welcome, all explorers. You're now watching the GeoShow USA edition, and the title of today's program is The Brooklyn Bridge, brought to you by Learn Around the World, bringing you guest speakers and virtual field trips just like this one from all around the planet. We're kicking off today's show with a survey question, and we'll be using Kahoot. Again, if you go to kahoot.it, enter in that game pin, 610-2477. That's also located in your chat box, teachers, of your Zoom window. You'll be logged right in and playing along with us. Now, these first couple questions are not worth points, so don't worry if you're not logged in yet. That is okay. You have plenty of opportunities before we start awarding points for our questions. But just as a reminder or an introduction, the way we use Kahoot here on the GeoShow is you only get 10 seconds to answer a question, so not a lot of time. So make sure you are looking thinking, and answering quickly. When you do answer, if you're playing as one-to-one students, don't look right down at your devices. You will only see a color-coded button. You must look up at the screen where you see me now to see the questions and the answers. And if you're quiet in class, I know it's hard, but if you're quiet, you can hear me read the questions as well. Well, we're kicking it off with our first survey question. As they say, the show must go on. So if you're not logged in yet, don't worry, you're not missing any points on this one. Again, go to kahoot.it, enter in that game pin, 610-2477. All right, we have 10 players in the game already, so we're going to go ahead and launch. Our first survey question of the day is, we're going to the Brooklyn Bridge. Where is the Brooklyn Bridge? Is it in red Chicago, blue New York City, yellow San Francisco, or green Miami? What do you guys think? All right, if you said blue New York City, you are correct. Okay, so it was blue New York City. And you are watching the Geo Show. We're a geography-based program, so that means location matters. So let's find out, where is the location of today's virtual field trip? And of course, it is in New York City. So where's New York City? We should start off with that one. So if we look at our globe, we'll spin it around, and today we're staying right inside the United States, so no passports required if you're watching from the US, that is. Well, New York City is located in the state of New York. New York is located on the eastern seaboard of the United States. So we'll go ahead and zoom right into it. And if we freeze it right there, so just to go ahead and give you a quick idea of where the state of New York is. So it's right here, this big old state. New York is actually a big state, but many people often think of just New York City. And New York City is located right on the water. So it's down here. I'm going to put in a dark blue spot. Don't worry, we're going to zoom into it. You may have heard of an area called Long Island as well. That would be this area right here, this island that's very long. It took a long time to come up with that name, didn't it? So let's go ahead and zoom right in, and let's take a look at New York City. So New York City is quite big as far as population and the area of the land. So if we look at it, New York City is broken up into something called boroughs. Can you guys say boroughs? So these are 5 boroughs. 5 boroughs make up New York City. And in fact, they used to be separate cities by themselves. But today they are all together. That makes up New York City as a whole. But each one of these boroughs acts as kind of like a small city by themselves. They have their own governments, but they all do function under New York City. Those boroughs, you may have heard of these before. So the Bronx, that's where the New York Yankees are located in that upper blue section. The green area is called Queens. Then we have Brooklyn, the red area. So we're talking a lot about Brooklyn today, the Brooklyn Bridge. This darker blue is Staten Island. And then we have Manhattan in the yellow. If you're asking yourself what's over here, that's New Jersey. Right across the Hudson River is New Jersey. All right. So these are the boroughs, the 5 boroughs of New York City. And as we zoom down, and we're going to look at right at the tip of Manhattan here. And why are bridges important? Well, if we look at the geography of New York City, and especially Manhattan, Manhattan is an island. So it's Manhattan Island. And over here we have the Hudson River. And over here we have the East River. And the East River is the one that we're going to focus on today. But as you can see, there is a big river, the East River, that separates Brooklyn over here in red and Manhattan over there in yellow. So before there were bridges, you had to take boats across. So the Brooklyn Bridge was the first one, and it connected these 2 lands, and that was very important. Today, there's other ways to get across. So there's actually tunnels that go under between Brooklyn and Manhattan that actually has a subway that goes under there. There's also car tunnels that go under as well. So lots of bridges, but we are focusing today on this one right here. Probably the most famous bridge in New York City, one of the most famous bridges in the USA, and dare I say the world. And but we can get a look. This one right next to it is called the Manhattan Bridge. And so there are lots of other bridges as well. But we are focusing on the Brooklyn Bridge today. Well, when we look at the Brooklyn Bridge, well, how big is the Brooklyn Bridge? Well, from one end to the other, it's 5,989 feet long. But just the section that crosses the river is 1,595 and a half feet. It's 85 feet wide, the bridge. And you can see it has two towers that makes up the bridge. And each of these towers are 276 and a half feet tall. And if you look at the middle of the bridge, oops, let me go back there. So if you look at the middle of the bridge, the clearance between the water and the middle of the bridge is 135 feet. So there are ships that can go under here, but not if they are taller than 135 feet. That would make that clearance. And then when we look over towards southern Manhattan here, so you can see all the skyscrapers today that makes up New York. This is what we think of today as New York City when you look at the skyline. But we can't think of New York City always being this way because it wasn't always this tall. In fact, when the Brooklyn Bridge was first constructed, so it was finished in 1883, it took 14 years to build. Remember these two towers I was just telling you about, 276 and a half feet tall? These were the tallest structures in the city at the time. In fact, there were no buildings. So look at all these buildings down here. So this is an illustration of what the city looked like when the Brooklyn Bridge was completed. At the time, there was no building that was over 6 stories high. So this was definitely the highest that anyone had ever been to, especially if they had never left the city before. It was truly like climbing a mountain. So when you walked across the Brooklyn Bridge, you used to look down on Brooklyn and down on Manhattan. But today, you're definitely looking up at especially Manhattan. Now, this was a huge event, guys. When the Brooklyn Bridge was open, I can't stress this enough, there were 14 tons of fireworks shot off at the opening ceremony of the Brooklyn Bridge. In fact, they were shooting constantly for over an hour. And I've seen interviews with people that were at this event, and if you were living it during this time, they would explain it that this was a bigger event than when man walked on the moon in the 60s. So to them, the people that were alive during both events, they were like, this was just huge. It was a huge celebration. This was the longest bridge in the world at the time when it was first constructed. And it was really important because it connected the cities of New York City. So Manhattan today, that was New York City, and the city of Brooklyn. Today, they're the same city of New York City. They're just called boroughs separately. That's a quick little introduction to the Brooklyn Bridge. We are going to talk a lot about the Brooklyn Bridge. We're going to take a virtual walk across the Brooklyn Bridge. You guys are going to see it, feel it, hear it yourselves. And we're going to talk about the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge and what type of bridge. It's a suspension bridge, but we'll talk about what makes a suspension bridge a suspension bridge. But before we jump into it, we do want to introduce our on-camera guests that we have along for the ride with us today. And we have lots of other classrooms watching. So our first random shout out today is going to Somas School, if I'm saying that correctly, out in California. So big shout out to everyone in California today. On camera with us today, first up, we have Mrs. Moss's 4th graders from Hillsborough, New Jersey. Welcome to the show, guys. All right. Awesome. And a quick poll. Has anyone ever walked across the Brooklyn Bridge in your classroom?
Oh, yeah. Wow.
Okay, so some of you. So everything that your classmates, everything that you see today, make sure you definitely after the show ask the people that's actually been across it to get their input as well. Do we have any fun facts about the Brooklyn Bridge from New Jersey today?
Derek, go ahead. Stand up.
Derek, come a little closer. I'm right here to the camera. Hold on. Let's get it on there.
They can't see your face. Go on your knees.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I'm lifting it up.
You're good. Go.
Go for it.
On opening day of like the Brooklyn Bridge, like you said, when they shot out fireworks, each person who walked across the bridge was charged 1 cent.
Okay, so this is a great time to talk about this as well, because today to cross the Brooklyn Bridge, it's free. So the Brooklyn Bridge, unlike many of the bridges in New York, there are no tolls to cross the Brooklyn Bridge today. But when it was first opened, yeah, they did have, it was a fee to cross the bridge. And I didn't even know the 1 cent on opening day. It's a great fun fact there. Let's go over next. We have Mrs. Goodrich's 5th graders from Carlisle, Arkansas. Welcome to the show, guys.
Hello.
Boom. All right. And a dab for good measure. All right. So does anyone have any fun facts from Arkansas today?
Elephants walked across the Brooklyn Bridge and proved how strong the bridge was.
Right. And I love this fun fact. I'm so glad you guys shared this with us. A great job. So we have to imagine ourselves, guys. So it's, it's a lot different today. Many of us today have been on airplanes. We've been in tall buildings sometimes when we travel to places like New York City. Maybe it's the Empire State Building. Maybe it's another one. But we're used to this kind of thing today. You have to imagine, guys, really use your imagination. In the late 1800s, especially in New York City, no building was over 6 stories high. And many people had never been that high before. These people were scared. In fact, before the Brooklyn Bridge, because the Brooklyn Bridge used a very important material, something called steel. So a lot of suspension bridges failed during the 1800s. There were many famous bridges that just collapsed. They did not work well. So it wasn't until they started using steel and the type of cabling, which we're going to learn about today, that made the Brooklyn Bridge so successful and so strong. And people were nervous. People were scared to cross the Brooklyn Bridge. So to try to get people to even use the bridge, one of the publicity stunts that they used was they marched elephants across the Brooklyn Bridge. And they were like, well, if it holds up elephants, surely it will hold up people. So I love that you guys shared that. In fact, before we get into it, just to let you guys know how scared a lot of people were, someone right after it opened, so it opened on May 24th, 1883, and just a few days later on May 30th, there was a stampede and 12 people died. So someone, while on the bridge, yelled out that the bridge is falling. The bridge was not really falling. So I don't know if it was done as a joke. I don't know why the rumor started and circulated on the bridge, but it really made people panic, and they were stampeding, trying to get off of the bridge before it collapsed in their mind. And a lot of people got crushed going down the steps to get off of the bridge. And so it's very dangerous. So even sometimes when we think we're joking around, sometimes it may not be a good place to joke around, especially when people are really scared, like when they're crossing a big bridge in the 1800s. All right, great fun facts from everyone. We're going to give another shout out real quick to Lakeside Elementary down in Florida. Big shout out to you guys as well. All right, so let's go ahead and start today with talking about what makes a suspension bridge. So we're going to learn the different parts of the suspension bridge. So when we start seeing these parts, we know what we're talking about, right? So let's go and dive right into it. And let's introduce suspension bridges. Then we'll go on our tour across the bridge and talk about the building of the bridge. Okay, so when we look at this bridge, again, this is a suspension bridge. So let's break down the basic parts of a suspension bridge. So the first thing you need is you need the towers. And depending on the bridge, sometimes I've seen suspension bridges with just one tower. I've seen suspension bridges with multiple towers. And in the Brooklyn Bridge's case, it has 2 towers. So you need a tower, and we'll talk about why that is. And these towers rest on what's called a pier if it's on dry land. In the case of the Brooklyn Bridge, these towers are actually in the water. So they're actually resting on something called a caisson. We'll learn what that is in just a few minutes. So there's a main cable that goes across, or multiple main cables that goes across the towers. So they're laid across, and those main cables are anchored in something called the anchorage. Can you guys say anchorage? Anchorage. So if you see that root word right there, anchor, can anyone tell me what an anchor is? Let's ask Mrs. Goodrich's class this time.
What's an anchor? Y'all get up there and tell them. A weight.
All right.
Something that weighs down.
Right, something weights down. Usually we think of like a boat, right? So a boat has an anchor. We weight down a boat if you're going out fishing or something like that in a lake. Well, it kind of works in the same way. So this entire bridge is anchored into the Anchorage. So these were on each side of the East River. So on the Manhattan side and on the Brooklyn side, there is one giant anchorage. So we'll talk about more how this was constructed. But our cables, in the case of the Brooklyn Bridge, there's 4 main cables. They are anchored into the anchorages. So all the weight, all the cars, the people, the elephants that crossed over the Brooklyn Bridge, all that weight was anchored into these anchorages. Now the deck, so this is what we think of as the roadway or the walkway of the bridge. Okay, so the deck of the bridge, and this is constructed and it's suspended from the main cables. This is where this type of bridge gets its name from, a suspension bridge, because the main cables is holding up all of the weights that is attached to the anchorage. And all of these smaller cables hanging down are called suspension cables, and they are basically the deck is hanging from these suspension cables. And this is how the suspension bridge gets its name. So now that we know the parts of the suspension bridge, you know what? Before we talk about the building of it, let's do a virtual tour. So let's do a bridge tour and let's go down and to New York City. So abracadabra, you guys are now in New York City. We're going to start on the Brooklyn side and we're going to walk over to Manhattan from Brooklyn. All right, so I just want everyone to take a quick look on the Brooklyn side and just look at the amount of traffic that we see, pedestrians, that's people traffic and car traffic on the Brooklyn side of the bridge. And we'll compare that when we get to Manhattan and you'll see the difference between the two. A couple of things when we go across is that there are 2 different walkways. So we're walking over the center part of the Brooklyn Bridge. So we'll see where the cars pass in just a minute. But there are 2 walkways, or there's 1 walkway, I should say, and a bike path. So it's very important that you stay on the proper side when you're crossing the Brooklyn Bridge. All right, and this is, you can see, this is definitely a newer section on the ends of the Brooklyn Bridge, and we're going to skip forward. It takes a while to walk across this thing. Luckily, on the virtual field trip, we get to bypass the long, boring parts of the walk. But as we start to approach the Brooklyn Bridge, we can see Manhattan in the background, see all those tall skyscrapers, and we get to start to see the towers. So we have the Brooklyn Tower and the Manhattan Tower is behind it. Again, these are 276.5 feet tall. Today, they're not the tallest structures in New York City, but they definitely were for a long time when it was built. So as we approach the Brooklyn Bridge, we're going to start to look on each side. So there's many types of traffic that go across the Brooklyn Bridge each and every day. So we're looking at the traffic coming out of Manhattan and into Brooklyn. So there are 3 lanes of cars on each side. There's 3 lanes on the other side going into Manhattan. Each and every day, about 124,000 vehicles cross the Brooklyn Bridge, and about 10,000 pedestrians cross the bridge. So that's people walking across the bridge. And then there's about 3,500 bicyclists that cross the bridge. As I said before, as we look at the boardwalk as we're crossing over, we want to stay on the left side going into Manhattan. That's where the pedestrians side is, and the bicycle side is the other side. Now, if you want to come to New York City, guys, I got a tip for you. If you want to get yelled at, I don't recommend it, but if you want to get yelled at, walk in the bike path. You will get yelled at, and it's a good idea to stay out of the bike path. All right, so as we start to get closer to the Brooklyn Tower, remember we talked about the parts of the bridge and what's holding up all of the weights. Well, in the Brooklyn Bridge's case, we have these 4 main cables, and these 4 main cables are anchored into the what?
Anchorage.
Anchorage. All right, you guys are awesome. So they are anchored into the anchorage, and we are actually on top of the anchorage right now. But if we look over to the side, let's take a look to the right. You can see that main cable. If we look back behind us, all this steel work. But right here, this is the main cable coming up out of the anchorage. And I'll show you some old photographs from the construction site when they were constructing it that shows how they are attached to the anchorage. But you can follow that main cable up with your eyes. all the way up, and it's draped over the Brooklyn Tower, droops down, and then back up to the Manhattan Tower, and then anchored on the Manhattan side again. Now, here's something that was added to the Brooklyn Bridge at the time. And when we look up at the suspension cables, so these are the cables that are hanging straight down, and I'll highlight those for you here. So these cables that are hanging straight down, these are what the deck is held up with. So that's what we're walking on right now. Now, one of the reasons that many of the suspension bridges failed before the Brooklyn Bridge is because they would sway back and forth. And this is located right near the coast, so lots of winds come. If you look at these diagonal cables, going across, these help stabilize. So they help cut down the sway from back and forth, side to side, and of the bridge when it's really windy, for example. But it gives it a beautiful effect of a spider web almost, the closer you get to the towers, as you can look up. Very beautiful. Very iconic. What's really neat about the Brooklyn Bridge is it's like a bridge between It's like a bridge between the old and the new, right? So we have these beautiful stone towers, these Gothic looking towers. You can see how massive they are when you get right up under them. And then you also have what's the part of the new. So it also has lots of steel incorporated into it, which is what we build most of our entire new bridges. Like over here, the Manhattan Bridge is made of mostly entirely steel. A couple other famous sites we can see already looking off to our right. We see the Empire State Building sticking up. That's a famous one in Midtown Manhattan. And there's a little close-up of the Empire State Building. Empire State Building is really cool to see at nighttime. So the Brooklyn Bridge is really cool to cross over at nighttime because you get to see all the city lit up, and the Empire State Building always has some unique lighting effects to it. So we just crossed under the Brooklyn side, and we're going over to the center of the bridge. We want to stop and look at one of these suspension cables. You get the idea how big it is when I wrap my hand around it. One thing we'll see here is part of the maintenance schedule. We are located, the ocean is just off that way right here. Remember, New York City is located right on the coast. And so there's salt water in the air, and we want to protect all of these metal parts. And so they paint the bridge as part of the maintenance. And what we're going to learn, the man who designed this bridge is a man named John Roebling, but he also had a cable company. And it was called Roebling Cable Company, but they designed actually a technique for cabling as well. It's called Roebling Cabling. And so this Roebling technique, you can see how the wires in that cable are twisted. And by twisting them in that fashion, it actually makes the overall cable stronger. And so that technique is called Roebling, named after John Roebling. When you get to the center point of the bridge, there's and any of those students from New Jersey that's been there knows this for sure. It gets really crowded. Lots of people want to take pictures. Why is that? Because one is because the main cables, they reach their lowest point, and so they're not in our way now. So we don't have any suspension cables, so we get lots of fantastic pictures of the city of Lower Manhattan, and even we looked at the Empire State Building off the other side of the bridge. Well, if we look off to the left side of the bridge going into Manhattan, we see another famous structure way out over on Liberty Island, and that's the Statue of Liberty. So another famous landmark of New York City. Great to see the Statue of Liberty as well when you come to New York City in the future, all of you that haven't been yet. So as we're crossing over to the Manhattan side, I'll turn up the volume so you can listen to the sounds of New York City and the Brooklyn Bridge. A lot more more people on the Manhattan side. Why is that? Well, a lot of tourists just walk out to the middle of the bridge, they take their pictures, and then they turn around and go back into Manhattan. So as you can see, it's a lot more crowded on this side. And remember, I talked about staying out of the bike lane. You'll really get yelled at on this side of the bridge. So here we get to see a tour group with a tour guide. So the Brooklyn Bridge, like all landmarks, they're great for tourist attractions. This helps raise money for locals that live in the city. We can see artists that come here to sell their artwork and to be inspired. Lots of great paintings, movies, music has been inspired by the Brooklyn Bridge. And again, bicyclists have to kind of slow down to make it through all of the people. I think it's a great time to talk as well. You know, when we travel places, if it's international or in our country, you know, it's important that we try to, you know, not be in the way of people going about their day-to-day lives, because, you know, people are going to work or going to school. We got a question yesterday. Can you take field trips through the Brooklyn Bridge? Yeah, we passed a classroom coming on the Brooklyn Bridge. They're going to walk by in just a minute. And so you can take field trips to the Brooklyn Bridge. It's really neat to do if you live near the area. As you can see, really, really crowded on this side of the bridge, the Manhattan side of the bridge. When we look over at Lower Manhattan, now we're still on the bridge, but I just want to point out a couple of things. Down here, this is somewhere around 6 stories high. So you have to use your imagination, guys. When in the late 1800s, we could look out over the entire city and probably look over to New Jersey as well, for a classroom in New Jersey, without seeing any buildings. We could see over top of all the buildings. Now, we can't do that today because as we look up, you can see all the skyscrapers that are located in New York City. So very high skyline. We definitely can't look across the island today. And some of these go up pretty high. All right, so as we're coming to the end of the Manhattan side, you see our bicyclists need to go right. We're going to go left because we're walking. And as we're coming off, we'll see lots of other people that are selling artwork. So the Brooklyn Bridge, again, is not, it's famous to see, but it's also important to the local economy because this is a spot that almost everyone that comes to New York City wants to walk across the Brooklyn Bridge. It's just that famous. And so it's a great place to come sell things, not only to sell items, but to also sell food, water, all kinds of street food you can find across the street as well. And then also street performers. So not really in this area, but New York City, one of the famous things to do, or things that I recommend, is lots of fantastic street performances that you can see while in New York City. And this is because so many tourists come to the Brooklyn Bridge, I've almost always seen street performances across the street. So we'll go across and check it out and see if anyone is there. And as we do, you know, you always want to make sure, guys, when you go into cities, especially if you're from a small town. I'm from a little small town in North Carolina, but, you know, you want to be safe when you're in a busy city, lots of traffic, buses, cars going by. So as we see them coming along, you always want to obey the crosswalk lights. So if you've never been to a city before, so those red hands mean stop, guys. So we wait to the go sign, and now we are good to go. All right, so we're going to cross the street. Over here, you see all these orange cones to the right. All right, so these are some street performers. They're not performing right now. They're getting ready to. There's lots of street performers do acrobatic tricks. They'll jump and do flips over people. It's really cool to see. And if you've never seen one before, speaking of bridges and public transportation, this is how you make it into subways in New York City. So if you look for those green balls, that is typically an entrance or exit to a subway stop. And so we have one right there. And right over here across the street, this is City Hall. You see all the people coming off of the Brooklyn Bridge. I just want to show you really quickly. This is City Hall right at the end where the Brooklyn Bridge ends in Manhattan. And I'll show you just because We have a little bit of time. And right here, so this is the front of City Hall. This is New York City Hall. And what's really just a fun fact about City Hall is the front of City Hall was made with, I believe, a marble, and it was expensive stonework. But on the back side of City Hall, when this was created, it was all just farmland, and just it was not city behind the City Hall, which today we know is just you know, the Empire State Building's back there, Times Square. In fact, they put a cheaper material on the back of City Hall because they didn't think that it would be the city was going to grow bigger. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and open up the floor for some questions. And so if you're on camera with us today, go ahead and get your question askers sent to the camera. If you're off of camera with us, go ahead and make sure you either get those questions sent in to hashtag GEOshow on Twitter, or use the Q&A app built right into your Zoom window. Let's start first with, let's go down to Arkansas. Looks like we have someone geared up. Go for it.
How long did it take to build the Brooklyn Bridge?
It took 14 years to build the Brooklyn Bridge. And part of the reason it took so long when we talk about the construction is those caissons. So those caissons took a long time to build, and I'll explain that more in depth in just a minute. Let's go over to Mrs. Moss's class. And do you guys have a question for us?
I know that John Augustus Roebling died from tetanus, and I was wondering if tetanus was a disease.
Right, it's tetanus. He died of tetanus. So if you guys have ever gotten a cut before, has anyone ever had to get a tetanus shot from the doctor?
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you ever stepped on like a rusty nail, or maybe you got bit by like sometimes people get bit by like hamsters, like their pets or something, and you have to get it. So today, yay modern medicine, yay vaccines, we get tetanus vaccines, and so that's a good thing. So tetanus is something that used to be more of a problem. If you get your vaccines today, it's not a problem. And so what happens with John Roebling is they were actually scouting out a site. So they were looking where they were going to build the Brooklyn Tower on the Brooklyn side. Where was the bridge? Where exactly was it going to connect Brooklyn to Manhattan? And a boat was coming in the dock. They were standing on the dock, and his foot actually got crushed in between two boards when the boat slammed against the dock. And so he got some really bad cuts on his foot, and he ended up getting tetanus. So even though he designed the Brooklyn Bridge, John Roebling actually died before construction even started. So his son, Washington Roebling, actually took over construction. Great question there. Again, no questions coming in, but if you're on the outside, get those sent in. And so we have time to answer yours as well. Mrs. Moyer's classroom, shout out Florida, wants to know about how long does it take to walk across the bridge? And do they use garters in the structure? I don't know what that is. The first part is, how long does it take to walk across the bridge? I've never walked across the bridge from point A to point B. I've always stopped to take pictures and putting all of this video together. It took me a really long time. I'm taking video, pictures, all that good stuff. And there's also at each tower, there are actually plaques that explains how the bridge was constructed as well. So there's lots of educational information on the Brooklyn Bridge as well. But I would guess if you walked from end to end and you walked it and didn't stop, maybe 20 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes. It's a long ways. It's over 5,000 feet. But yeah, if you walk straight across, you could definitely do it quicker. Great question coming in there. And let's go ahead and talk about the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge and what was that whole process like. And when we talk about the Brooklyn Bridge in this time period, guys, so remember it was constructed from 1869 to 1883, so it took 14 years. What else was happening at this time? The light bulb was invented during this time, the telephone, the curveball was brought into baseball. So indoor plumbing was put in the White House. So these are all things that were happening around the same time period as the Brooklyn Bridge was being built. Okay, so first of all, why do you need a bridge here? Okay, so during the late 1800s, they had a couple of bad winters, and the entire East River froze over. So that stopped all of the ferry traffic, all of the boat traffic. So it was really becoming apparent that they needed another way to connect Brooklyn and New York City at the time. Manhattan was called New York City, but today we call it Manhattan because New York City includes Brooklyn and all the others that I showed you before. And so they they knew they needed a bridge. Now, John Roebling had built some other successful suspension bridges. He built the Niagara Bridge. He built the bridge in Cincinnati. And so they hired him to build a bridge here. And so the Brooklyn Bridge was designed by John Roebling. And again, we just learned he died of tetanus, so he never saw it finished. But his son, Washington Roebling, took over. He was only 32 years old when he took over, and he finished. He actually added some changes to the design. They actually ended up making it a little bit bigger. So he had to make those changes. So he does get some credit, some engineering credit as well in the design. And but he oversaw most of the building of the bridge. And I say most because he actually got sick. We'll talk about how, but he got sick of something called Caissons Disease, and he actually sat in his apartment from Brooklyn, and his wife actually went back and forth, Emily, and she actually did a lot of the management of the bridge, and she was actually the first person to cross the bridge on a cart, horse and cart, kind of cool. So the first thing that you have to build when you build a suspension bridge is the towers. So you need something to drape those cables over, right? So here's how they did it. Now it's hard to build underwater, right? So how do you build underwater? They did it with something called a caisson. Can you guys say caisson?
Caisson.
So basically, they got shipbuilders to make essentially what it is a big box. If you take any box and you turn it upside down and you put it in the water, right? So it's going to be up. It's going to be open on the bottom side and closed on the top. So they basically had a giant wooden structure that they floated out into the very spot where they wanted to construct it. And then they started weighting it down. So when they started weighting these caissons down, they ended up putting about 70,000 tons of stone and brick on top of these caissons to sink it down. It took about a week to sink it down to the bottom of the water. They would go about half a foot down at a time. Each time they layered it down. So 70,000 tons of stone and brick on top of it. Now, when it hit the mud, you can't just build a tower on top of mud. That is not a good engineering technique, right? So they were trying to get down to bedrock, and that's under the mud. And so what they did is they put a couple of shafts in here, and so it allowed people to go down into the caisson from the surface. So they pumped all the water out from the caisson. They filled it up with air, compressed air, and they had a water shaft as well. So when they dug out the mud, they actually had kind of like a crane and a scoop that would pull it up through the water shaft. And that's how they got all the mud out. And they dug all the way down until they hit bedrock. Now, on the Brooklyn side, this was about 44 feet below the surface of the water. On the Manhattan side, they got to 78 feet and still did not hit bedrock. In fact, they had so many people were getting injured and sick that they decided to shut it down. And so the Manhattan side to this day is not sitting on bedrock. They're about 30 feet short of bedrock. So why was it so dangerous working in these caissons? One is sometimes air bubbles would just pop out the side. So people from time to time would just get shot up to the surface. They would get sucked out under the edge of the caisson and float up to the surface of the river. But what made it really dangerous is something called Caissons disease, but today we know it as the bends. So some of you may have heard of this if you have any scuba divers in your families, or maybe you've been scuba diving yourself. It's what you're dealing with when you go underwater. Every 10 meters you go underwater is what we call 1 atmosphere of pressure. So that equals the same amount of pressure that is from the surface of Earth all the way to the edge of the atmosphere. That's why it's called 1 atmosphere. And for every 10 meters you go down is another atmosphere. So it's more and more pressure. The more and more pressure you get on you, you get something called the bends, or potentially the bends, when nitrogen, which at surface level, nitrogen is too big to enter through your skin, but when it gets compressed, that means those nitrogen bubbles get really, really small. They can go through your skin. If you come up to the surface too quickly, that nitrogen bubble will expand inside of your body instead of outside of your body. And that will cause something called the bends. And at the time, they called it Caissons Disease. This is a illustration of those caissons, as you can see, much bigger than my little simple drawing. They had a couple of those water shafts in here, and many of them to go down back and forth. So once the caissons were constructed, they were able to build the towers up from there. The next phase of building a suspension bridge and the Brooklyn Bridge was to install the main cables. And so this is a diagram that you can see on the Brooklyn Bridge of one of those main cables. They're actually made up of 19 strands, and in each of those strands are wires. So they are pencil thin wires, which brings us to our next survey question. So if we look at the wires that make up the cables of the Brooklyn Bridge, they are about 1/8 of an inch thick. We call this, they are 8-gauge wires, or sorry, 1/4 of an inch thick, about the size of a pencil, more or less. So what do you guys think? How many of these wires are in the 4 main cables of the Brooklyn Bridge? That's what I want to know from you guys on our next survey question, which is coming up in 3, 2, 1. All right, how many wires are in the 4 main cables? Is it red, over 20,000 wires, blue, 5,000 wires, yellow, under 1,000 wires, or green, 10,000 wires? What do you guys think? All right, so if you chose red, over 20,000 wires, you are correct. So how many wires are actually in this thing? Well, if we take a look at it, let's break it down. So there's 4 main cables going across the bridge. In each of those cables, those 4 main cables, there are 19 strands. In each one of those strands, there are 278 wires that makes up each one of those strands. And each of these wires, just by themselves, are 1/4 of an inch thick. And when we put all of that together, the main cable all the way across, the diameter, so if we measure all the way across, is 15 3/4 inches is how big the main cable is. Now, all of these wires all put together, you know, makes up a lots of cable. In fact, there's over 14,000 miles of wires that make up the main cables. And if we look at a picture from the late 1800s when the Brooklyn Bridge was going up, so here's the towers that are up, and then they start pulling, and they have to pull each one of these little wires over one at a time. So you go back and forth between the anchorages. And once those are all back and forth, then you start walking across and putting those together. So someone's job is to walk and start adding those strands together and then wrapping all of the 19 strands together. So that's how these 4 main cables are constructed. Remember, they're anchored into the anchorages. So there's an Anchorage has an anchor. The entire Anchorage has an anchor inside of it, and there's chains that come up off of the eye bolts that each one of these wires are connected to. So what does that look like? So inside of that Anchorage, so in each of these blocks is one of these things, or sorry, 4. There's one for each of the main cables. And these guys are 23 tons, okay? So big, heavy duty anchor that is anchoring the entire Brooklyn Bridge. And the last thing that you do is you put the deck on. So the very last thing you do is suspend the deck. Now, this isn't the Brooklyn Bridge. I couldn't find any pictures of that from the late 1800s, but this is from the Manhattan Bridge, but it would have been done the same way. So they started on both sides, and you would have people working towards the middle. So you hang the suspension cables from the main cables, and then you attach the deck sections to the suspension cables. And this is how the Brooklyn Bridge was constructed. All right, so how many steel wires hold up the Brooklyn Bridge? I don't know how many wires, or I cannot find the information. I haven't found of how many wires are in all of the suspension cables hanging down on the Brooklyn Bridge, but there are definitely a lot just in the main cables. Coming in over on our Q&A app, let's see, about how many people did it take to construct the bridge? So the numbers I found, there's a lot of variation of the total number of workers, because there wasn't, as far as I can find, a primary source directly from the construction logs of the Brooklyn Bridge, but I found from history.com states 600 workers, and about 20 to 30 or so died during the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. And they also wanted to know how much did it cost to build. Well, it cost $15,500,000 at the end of the 1800s. So in today's money, that would be around $385 million if we wanted to build the Brooklyn Bridge today. So it was a great job. So it's a very large amount of money. And the way that they split it up is that the city of New York at the time, for every dollar, they paid 33 cents on the dollar, and Brooklyn had to pay 66 cents on the dollar. So they split it up into Brooklyn paid for 2/3 of the bridge, and Manhattan, or New York City at the time, paid for 1/3 of the bridge. How was the cable twisted? So when those wires, they were bunched into strands, and the 19 strands on the main cable. So the actual main cable was not twisted with that Roebling technique. That was only on the suspension cables. But what they did is they put the strands together, and then they took more wire and they wrapped around all of those 19 strands to hold them together. So they're actually all straight wires that are wrapped into 19 strands, bunches of 270 or 78, and then all of them wrapped together as one big, massive cable. Great question there. Let's go over to Mrs. Moss's classroom. Do you guys have a question for us?
Absolutely. Go ahead. Who hasn't gone? Arthur? Go to the camera. Okay. Ask one of your questions.
Come on, Arthur.
How much workers got benched during the building of the bridge?
Yeah, a lot of people. I found I had a number. I can, if you want a specific number, I can give you. Okay, 110 cases. So Caissons disease on January 25th, just when one doctor was looking at it, he found 110 cases of Caissons disease, which is today what we know as the bends. And so, yeah, lots of people were getting this. In fact, Washington Roebling, he got a really bad case of the bends, and it really affected the way he walked. It almost paralyzed him. So basically, for the remaining time of building the bridge, he stayed in his apartment on the Brooklyn side and just would look out the window. And his wife, Emily, did the majority of the management of the construction of the bridge. And she was actually the first person to ride across the bridge. She went across on a buggy with a rooster because a rooster was a symbol of victory. And so she carried a rooster across. Let's go down to Arkansas. Do you guys have a question for us?
Any questions? Carlos, hop up and ask your question. Stand up. Okay, right here. Hurry. Say it really loud.
Is the Brooklyn Bridge the largest bridge?
Not any longer. Not any longer. You know what? I don't know currently what the largest bridge in the world is, but it's not even in New York. So the Verrazano, I know I'm saying that incorrectly. Verrazano Bridge is actually longer than, or much bigger than, the Brooklyn Bridge. This is really cool. It connects Staten Island to Brooklyn. It's so big that the two towers actually are tilted back a little bit to compensate for the curve of the earth. This bridge is so long that they had to, when they engineered it, they had to compensate for the curve of the earth. So it's really neat how they constructed that one. But great question. And we're going to jump right into our Geo quiz because we are 5 minutes past 45. So we're going to jump right into our quiz and go ahead and play. If you have to head out, you can head out at any point. If you have time to stick around and keep asking questions, then hang around after the quiz, and I'll open up our floor for a lightning round of questions. But right now we are using Kahoot to play for that postcard from me, GOB from the Learn Around the World Studios. Make sure you're signed in with Kahoot's ID today, which is 610-2477. And our first question coming up is, remember, every question is worth points from here on out. And the quicker you answer correctly, the more points you will get. How many boroughs are in New York City? How many boroughs are in New York City? Remember way back when we talked about that? Is it red 5, blue 4, yellow 3, or green 2? All right, five boroughs. Great job. So remember, the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island, and Manhattan. Agent Cat takes the lead. Great job. The Brooklyn Bridge is a suspension bridge. Is that blue true or red false? Okay, that is true. It is a suspension bridge. Great job. Agent Cat still in the lead. Who designed the Brooklyn Bridge? Who designed? Was it Washington Roebling red, John Roebling blue, George Washington green, or Frederick Law Olmsted yellow? Right, it was John Roebling. So Washington actually oversaw the construction, but John actually designed the bridge. All right, Agent Cat's in the lead. The Brooklyn Bridge connects Brooklyn and what other borough? Does it connect Brooklyn and the Bronx, Brooklyn and Staten Island, Brooklyn and Queens, or Brooklyn and Manhattan? All right, Manhattan. All right, Agent Cat. And what river does the Brooklyn Bridge cross? Is it red, the East River, blue, the New York River, yellow, the Hudson River, or green, the Mississippi River? All right, it is the East River. And today's winner is dun, 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 Agent Cat takes it home. Congratulations to you, Agent Cat. If you are Agent Cat's teacher, please send me your school address. And you can do that in one place and one place only, and that's at learnaroundtheworld.com/prize. That's the URL at the bottom of your screen, learnaroundtheworld.com/prize. All right, we're going to open it up for a lightning round of questions. If you have time to stick around with us, great. Keep them coming. So first up, we have on our Q&A app, the students want to know, is there a toll charge to drive through the bridge? No, not today. There was a toll at the beginning, but today the Brooklyn Bridge is free to cross. There is no toll, but that is not true for many of the other bridges around New York. Okay, let's go down to Arkansas. Do you guys have a question?
You may have a question. I think we're good.
Okay, we're going to go over to Mrs. Moss's classroom. Do you guys have a question for us?
We do.
Good, right there.
The bridge is 134 years old. What is done to keep it safe and modern?
Right. So if you go to the MTA's website, so that's the Metro Transportation Authority, I believe. That's who oversees the construction and the maintenance schedule of the Brooklyn Bridge. So as we talked about earlier, they do regular paintings. They will also replace out sections of the bridge if it needs. I believe the current, they do phases. They do upkeep and maintenance. I believe right now they are moving, I believe the next project coming up is going to be an expansion of the own ramp on the Brooklyn side, if I'm not mistaken, but I may need to double check on that. The last time I checked was what they had coming up on their maintenance schedule. But I can tell you that it is the Transportation Authority that oversees the maintenance of the Brooklyn Bridge. And yes, it does require maintenance to keep it safe. Great question there. Mrs. Shaw's classroom wants to know, how many gallons of paint does it take to paint the bridge? I don't know. I've looked. I'm going to try to find it again. Speaking of the MTA and their website, I'm going to try to find again if I can find how much paint they use. but I do know they do it in sections many of the time. So, you know, it depends on what section they're doing, but I'll see if I can find that and post it over to Flipgrid as well. And let's see, how old is the bridge? So we just learned from our classroom, it's over 100 years old, but it was finished in 1883. So it's from 1883 to 2018. Let's go back to Mrs. Moss's classroom. Do you guys have another question?
Did the son live to see the Brooklyn Bridge finished?
Yeah, so he was living when it was finished, but he did have the bends. He had the Caissons disease, so he wasn't out walking around a lot at that time. So yeah, so his wife actually, I think she should get more credit when we look up at people. Like, we give the Roeblings a lot of credit, the men. But Emily, it was very important for the construction of the bridge because she saw the day-to-day operations, basically. Washington kind of came up with a lot of the plans from the apartment, but she was on the ground overseeing everything. So she was very instrumental in the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. And because of that, she was the first person to cross it.
Thank you. All right, thank you.
All right, and let's see, also coming on, how did he catch the bends? So he caught the bends down in a caisson, and I believe he got his when he was on the Brooklyn side. But the Manhattan side was deeper, so it was even more of a problem then. Today we know a lot more about the bends, so it's safer for scuba divers, for example. So basically, the deeper and the longer you stay down at depth with that pressure on you, the more it opens up the door for you to get the bends or Caissons disease. So the idea is you got to come up a little bit at a time, and you do it over a long period of time. This helps that nitrogen exit your body. Okay, great question. Do we have another one over in New Jersey?
I think we're all good.
Thank you so much.
We're all good. Okay, well, we're going to wrap it up with that then. So thank you, everyone, for coming along with us today to New York City. All right, so bye, guys. I'm GOB. You've been watching the Geo Show. Until next time, guys, don't forget it's a big world and country, so get out there and explore it. Bye. Oh, they are excited.